I'm Ethan, 28, and life has finally settled down. I've been married to Haley, who's also 28, for a few years now, and just a few months ago, we welcomed our first child, a little boy. We were over the moon and couldn't wait to share our happiness with the world, so we posted a few photos of our son on Facebook. I didn't think twice about it, but somehow, those photos reached my dad, a man I've purposely kept out of my life for nearly a decade. I hadn't expected him to see the photos, never mind reach out after all this time. A lot led to this point. My dad and I fell out years ago over something that was, to me, a major betrayal. It happened around the time I was finishing high school, full of ambition and dreams for the future. My grades were solid, and I was set on going to college. All I needed was a little financial support from my dad, who had a good job as head of sales at a firm. I wasn't asking for a handout, just a helping hand. To my shock, he refused. I tried to understand, but it didn't make sense until I found out he'd decided to pay my cousin Peter's tuition in full. Peter and I were close in age, only a few months apart, and though we weren't siblings, we'd always been compared. The rivalry was always there, but it grew into something uglier over time, especially with the way my dad seemed to favor him. When he paid Peter's way through college, without even offering to help me, it felt like the ultimate slap in the face. You see, my dad had been a single parent from the time I was a baby. My parents split up early on, and my mom wasn't ready for motherhood, so she drifted out of the picture. Meanwhile, Peter grew up with both his parents, but they ran a cafe and were always busy, so Peter would tag along with us a lot, especially as kids. My dad was more than willing to take on that role, providing for him and his family as if they were his own. Peter's family leaned on my dad financially, and as a kid, I understood why he helped. I mean, it made sense they were struggling, and my dad had the means to lend a hand. I never thought it was unfair until college came around. Peter had struggled in school, especially with math, and I often came out ahead academically. I assumed that would be enough to make my dad notice my hard work. But that tuition decision changed everything. My dad's reasoning? Peter's family needed it more. As for me, he expected me to apply for scholarships, loans, whatever it took. He thought it would build character. But I felt betrayed. My own father chose my cousin over me, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. I confronted him about it, and our argument escalated quickly. I told him that Peter wasn't my responsibility, and that he wasn't obligated to prioritize Peter over his own son. That comment lit a fuse. He threw back that if I couldn't understand why he was helping Peter, I was better off finding my own way. I was hurt and angry, so I left. I moved in with friends, taking only a few things and leaving behind everything I knew. From then on, life was hard. Without my dad's support, I had to give up on college almost immediately. My scholarship didn't cover enough, and the student loans fell through. I took on a temp job just to cover the basics, scraping by with barely enough for rent, food, and bills. It wasn't easy, but somehow I managed to keep going. Over time, through sheer hard work and persistence, I climbed the ranks and got to a good place at the same company. That's where I met Haley. Now, I feel like all those struggles were worth it. I may not have the degree I wanted, but I have a family that means everything to me. Haley and I are doing well, and our son brought a happiness I never expected. Still, there's a part of me that's carried a deep bitterness toward my dad. I always thought that if he'd just acknowledged his mistake, maybe things could have been different. But he never did. He tried reaching out through the years, texts on my birthday, the occasional holiday message, even a note on my wedding day. But it was all surface level, never addressing what actually broke us apart. So, when my phone lit up with his name a few days after I posted my son's photos, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe finally he'd apologize. When I picked up, though, the first thing he said was how hurt he was that I'd gotten married and had a son without him. He didn't mention his past choices or apologize for how he'd treated me, he only focused on himself. He told me it was time to let go of what happened 10 years ago, to stop being so dramatic about it. Hearing him dismiss everything like that made my blood boil. I told him I regretted not blocking him sooner. I'd been waiting years for an apology that was never going to come. He didn't understand why I was so angry, and we ended up shouting at each other. In a moment of pure frustration, I told him he should just call Peter his real son, since he'd clearly been more important to him than I ever was. And then I hung up, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. I'd finally told him how I felt, but I knew my words were going to cause ripples. It didn't take long. My aunt, Peter's mom, reached out soon after. She was hurt by what I'd said and told me I'd gone too far. Out of everyone in the family, she'd always been kind to me growing up, never pitting Peter and me against each other like everyone else seemed to. Haley thought I should at least apologize to her since she wasn't the one at fault, so I decided to reach out. I texted my aunt, explaining that my anger was directed at my dad, not her. I apologized for dragging her into it, but made it clear I couldn't just let go of everything without some acknowledgement from my father. To her credit, my aunt accepted my apology. She told me she understood my perspective and forgave me, but then added that my dad and uncle were still upset and expected an apology from me too. That part irked me. I told her as politely as I could that while I was sorry for hurting her, I had no plans to apologize to my dad or my uncle. They were the ones who had treated me unfairly, and I was done bending over backward to appease them. For a while, things were quiet. Then Peter posted a long rant on Facebook. He accused me of disrespecting his family, claiming I was just jealous because my dad had favored him. Reading it, I felt a fresh wave of frustration. I wanted to reply, to explain how things had really been, to lay it all out: his privileged treatment, the tuition choice, the favoritism. But Haley stopped me. She reminded me that engaging would only fuel Peter's desire for drama. So instead, I ignored it. I blocked him without saying a word. Ignoring him felt powerful. It was my way of reclaiming control over the situation, refusing to be pulled into a petty argument that would only benefit Peter. I focused on Haley and our son, choosing not to waste energy on people who didn't truly care about me. Some mutual friends later told me that Peter eventually took the post down. They'd commented on his post, standing up for me, and hinted that if he didn't stop, they'd share the full story. Not wanting to be exposed, he quietly deleted the rant. But of course, it didn't end there. He started privately messaging my friends, telling them they were on the wrong side for supporting me. To him, this family drama was like some epic feud. It was embarrassing to see him go so far over something that happened years ago, but I just kept ignoring it. Each time he tried to provoke me, I pushed it aside, staying focused on the people who mattered: Haley and my son. I thought maybe things would finally cool down, but a few weeks later, I received an email from my uncle. He hadn't reached out since all of this started, so I was curious but hesitant to open it. Haley thought reading it might offer some closure. So, after debating for a while, I clicked on it, only to find a long, passive-aggressive message thanking me for being a jerk. The truth I discovered felt like a gut punch, a blow I could barely comprehend. Peter, my cousin, my childhood rival, was actually my half-brother, the product of a long-buried affair between my dad and my aunt. It was hard enough to swallow that betrayal, but things kept spiraling out of control. My uncle's furious emails were only the beginning. He didn't hold back, making it clear that he blamed me for uncovering the affair. He insisted that if I hadn't said anything to my dad, he would have never known. In his second email, his anger came through like never before. He told me his marriage was ending because of this, that my aunt had betrayed him, and now he was left picking up the pieces. Even Peter, he said, had abandoned them both, cutting off all ties and moving out of state. My uncle felt I'd torn his world apart, and in his eyes, I was now the villain. For a long time, I stared at the screen, reading and rereading his words. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out that none of this was my fault. But deep down, I knew it would be pointless. This was a family lie that had finally come to light, and all the resentment, pain, and anger it brought with it couldn't be contained. I didn't create this mess, I had just accidentally revealed it. It wasn't me who had betrayed him, it was my dad and aunt. But he couldn't bring himself to accept that. The pain of realizing his marriage was a sham, of knowing his son didn't want anything to do with him, had him lashing out at me. In his eyes, I was an easy target. Haley, my wife, had been a rock through it all. She listened patiently every night as I tried to process each new revelation. She held me when I was overwhelmed and reminded me that I'd done nothing wrong. It was my dad's and aunt's decisions that had caused this, not mine. She helped me see that I wasn't the one who'd betrayed anyone. I was just the one who had the courage to confront it, even if it was unintentional. That first email from my uncle hadn't been his last. As days went by, he sent more messages, each angrier than the last, accusing me of destroying his family and reminding me of the consequences of my recklessness. I could feel his desperation. He was losing everything he'd known, and he needed someone to blame. But I'd had enough. The next time I got an email from him, I didn't respond. I knew it was better to cut contact and protect myself from his anger. I blocked his email, determined to move on. As for Peter, his silence was perhaps the loudest reaction of all. He had vanished, gone off the grid, leaving a single Facebook post announcing he was done with the drama. That was it, no goodbyes, no explanations. Part of me wondered if he felt betrayed too, learning that his entire life had been a lie. His mother wasn't who he thought she was, and his father wasn't the man he'd idolized. I felt for him in a way I hadn't before. We had grown up as cousins, but there had always been this hidden distance, a rift I couldn't explain. Now I understood. My dad had treated him differently, shown him a type of attention I'd never received, and I had felt that deeply as a child. But knowing why it happened, and that it was never truly about me, was bittersweet. I didn't feel the need to chase after Peter. Blood may connect us, but it didn't mean we were family in the ways that mattered. One evening, I got a message from my dad. It was short, to the point, just a brief apology, where he said he was sorry things had ended this way. He wrote that he regretted his choices and hoped I could find peace. I didn't know how to feel about it. This was the man I'd spent years trying to please, always wondering why I wasn't good enough in his eyes. And now, instead of a real apology, all I got was a sentence and a vague statement of regret. I wasn't sure if he was apologizing for the affair, for lying, or just for getting caught. Haley urged me to see it as some kind of closure, a step forward. But honestly, it didn't feel like enough. There was no acknowledgement of the pain his favoritism had caused me or the years I'd spent feeling like I was second best. I had once dreamed of an apology, of him finally seeing me, understanding my hurt, and asking for forgiveness. But this wasn't it, and I decided not to respond. This might be the end of our relationship, and maybe that was for the best. With my family crumbling around me, I realized there was one good thing that had come out of all this. I finally understood my own worth. I had spent years looking for validation from my dad, trying to be enough. But in reality, I didn't need his approval. I had my own family now, and Haley and our son were the people who mattered most to me. Every day, as I watched my son grow, I found new reasons to leave the past behind and focus on building a better future for him. I wanted to be the kind of father I'd always wished I had. Haley and I would stay up late, talking about everything. She shared stories from her own life and reassured me that family wasn't just about blood, it was about who showed up, who cared, and who stayed. She believed that we were finally free to build our own version of family, a future without the weight of my dad's lies or the shadow of favoritism that had loomed over my childhood. For the first time, I felt like I had a fresh start. About a month after my uncle's last email, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed. The bitterness, the anger, the confusion, it all felt a bit lighter now. No, there was no satisfaction in what had happened, but there was a kind of peace that came with knowing the truth. I finally knew why things were the way they were. There was no more wondering, no more trying to earn something that had never really been mine to win. In the end, I understood that my dad and aunt's choices were never about me. Their mistakes were their own, and I didn't have to carry the weight of their actions. I could let go of that resentment, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. The same went for Peter. We were half-brothers, but that didn't mean we had to force a connection. I'd found my family in Haley and our son, and that was enough. The hardest part was accepting that the past couldn't be changed. But I was finally at a place where I could move forward. The pain would always be there, but I no longer felt like it defined me. I had lived in the shadow of my dad's lies for long enough, and now I was ready to step into the light of my own life. The strangest part of it all was that, despite the chaos, I felt a sense of freedom. With the truth out in the open, I could leave that chapter behind me. I was done looking for validation from people who couldn't give it. My focus was on the family I had chosen, the family I was building. My past would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. If my dad, my uncle, or Peter ever wanted to make peace, I would hear them out. But I wasn't waiting for that day to come. I was in charge of my own story now, and I was determined to write it the way I wanted. As for my dad, my uncle, and Peter, they would have to deal with the fallout of their choices in their own way. They might find peace, they might not. But for the first time, that wasn't my problem. I'd finally found mine.